My sister sent a text message that finally severed the last remaining thread of our family. She told me that if I showed up to her wedding, I would ruin everything. She explicitly instructed me to leave my weird kid at home and just stay away. I did not shed a single tear. I did not type out an angry reply. Instead, I quietly froze every line of credit tied to my name. 3 days later, standing at the front desk of her elite wedding venue, her platinum card was declined. My mother, her face flushed with absolute panic, called my phone 68 times in a row. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family, and hit them where it hurts the most. My name is Riley, and I am 30 years old. I work as a tech product manager at a major corporation in Seattle. I have spent the last decade building a quiet, stable life for myself and my 8-year-old son, Leo. Leo has mild Asperger syndrome. He is a brilliant and gentle boy who loves complex puzzles and is very sensitive to loud noises. To me, he is absolutely perfect. But to my family, he was always treated as an inconvenience. The group chat notification dinged while I was pouring my morning coffee. I glanced at the screen and saw the message from my 28-year-old sister Madison. She was the undisputed golden child, a woman who cared more about her social media aesthetic than the feelings of anyone around her. Her text read exactly as I told you. She said that if I showed up, I would ruin everything, and she told me not to bring my weird kid. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from surprise, but from the sheer cruelty of her words. But the real blow came seconds later. My parents, Brenda and Thomas, both reacted with a heart icon to Madison's message. They co-signed the banishment of their own daughter and grandson without a single thought. They did not defend Leo. They simply validated Madison's bigotry. I put my phone face down on the granite counter. I refused to cry over people who treated my son like a burden. I took a deep breath, opened my laptop, and focused on my own future. I was in the middle of closing on a beautiful 3-bedroom house in a top-tier school district. It was going to be a fresh start for Leo, a place with a big backyard where he could play safely. My mortgage broker had just sent an email regarding my final pre-approval. I clicked it open, expecting a simple confirmation, so we could proceed with the closing and sign the final papers. The email was not a confirmation. It was a severe warning. My broker stated that my immaculate credit score, which I had protected fiercely for a decade, had mysteriously plummeted by over 200 points in just a few months. The banking system had flagged my debt-to-income ratio as critically high. My broker asked if I was aware of the $120,000 in outstanding credit card debt recently tied to my Social Security number. The words blurred on the screen. $120,000. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had zero credit card debt. I paid off my balances in full every single month. I lived well beneath my means specifically so I could provide a secure life for Leo. I immediately logged into my financial dashboard and pulled my official credit report. My hands were shaking as the screen loaded, revealing 3 platinum-tier credit cards opened under my Social Security number within the last 8 months. I clicked on the details for these fraudulent accounts. The billing address listed for all 3 cards was my parents' suburban home. I stared at the transaction history, my blood running completely cold as the pieces clicked together. There were massive charges listed one after the other. A $15,000 charge at a Vera Wang bridal boutique, a $20,000 deposit for a high-end catering company, thousands of dollars spent at luxury florists and expensive event rental agencies. My parents and my sister had stolen my Social Security number. I suddenly remembered a weekend visit last year when my mother asked me to help her sort through some old boxes in the attic. She had kept all my old college financial aid documents and tax forms. They had quietly committed identity theft to fund Madison's extravagant dream wedding. They had barred me from attending the event, calling my son a weird kid, completely unaware that they were using my stolen credit to pay for every single champagne flute, silk napkin, and designer gown. The sheer audacity of their betrayal left me breathless. They were perfectly willing to destroy my financial future, ruin my chances of buying a safe home for Leo, and completely bankrupt me just so Madison could show off for her wealthy fiancé, Jamal. Jamal was a highly successful African-American man who owned a chain of high-end restaurants across the city. He was a good man who valued family, and Madison was obsessed with proving she belonged in his elite social circle. She was funding her entire fake persona with my ruined credit. I did not scream. I did not call my mother to demand an explanation. Emotional reactions were exactly what they expected from me. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. A cold, calculating calm settled over my mind. They wanted a flawless, expensive wedding. I reached out and coldly picked up my phone. I dialed the fraud department of my bank. A representative answered, and I spoke with absolute terrifying clarity. I stated my name and my social security number. I told the representative that I had not authorized any of these platinum accounts. I want to report a massive case of identity theft, I said, making sure my voice did not shake. And please, I need you to freeze all of these accounts immediately. Shut them down so not a single additional cent can be processed. The operator confirmed my request, and I listened to the keyboard clicking on the other end of the line. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the windows, completely disconnected from the panic that was about to unfold across town. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink. I did not need caffeine anymore. The pure adrenaline of taking back my power was enough. The wedding was fast approaching, and my toxic family had absolutely no idea that their limitless budget had just been completely erased. The voice of the bank investigator, Agent Miller, was strictly professional. He asked a series of rapid-fire questions to verify my identity and confirm the scope of the unauthorized charges. I answered each one with deliberate precision. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I simply stated the facts. Agent Miller paused, the sound of his typing echoing softly over the line. He warned me that proceeding with a formal fraud claim would trigger a serious chain of events. He explained that claiming identity theft, especially with a balance exceeding $100,000, would automatically initiate a criminal investigation. He made it perfectly clear that this was not a simple billing dispute. Once the accounts were frozen, it would become a matter for law enforcement, and I would not be able to simply call back and cancel the investigation if I changed my mind. I told him I understood completely. I instructed him to proceed. An email chimed in my inbox. It contained a secure link to a digital affidavit. I opened the document, reading through the dense legal warnings detailing the penalties for filing a false report. Without a second of hesitation, I typed my full legal name, applied my digital signature, and clicked Submit. Agent Miller confirmed receipt. He informed me that the 3 platinum accounts were now permanently locked. Any future authorization attempts would be instantly rejected and flagged by their security division. I thanked him and ended the call. 3 bright red banners appeared across my banking dashboard, stamping the words, "Account frozen," over the massive balances. The invisible bleed on my financial future had been stopped. Halfway across the city, in an entirely different reality, Madison was blissfully ignorant. I opened a secondary social media account I kept for monitoring her public antics and navigated to her Instagram page. A purple ring around her profile picture indicated a live story. I clicked it. Madison filled the screen standing in the lavish, marble-floored tasting room of Seattle's most expensive boutique bakery. She was holding a crystal flute filled with sparkling rose. Beside her stood a towering 6-tier wedding cake decorated with cascading edible gold leaf and delicate sugar orchids. She posed, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. "Cheers to a limitless budget," she trilled into the camera, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She panned her phone to show off the intricate details of the frosting. A $5,000 cake might seem a little crazy to some people, but Jamal and I only deserve the absolute best. You only get married once, right? Madison took a delicate sip of her champagne, smiling radiantly. She was completely unaware that the heavy metal credit card, currently sitting inside her designer clutch, was now nothing more than a useless piece of plastic. I closed the social media application, feeling nothing but cold indifference toward her arrogant display. I logged out of my frozen banking portal and opened a new search window. I typed in the name of the venue Madison had been boasting about for months, the Grand Bellevue. It was an elite, historically preserved mansion downtown, known for hosting the most exclusive high society events. As a tech product manager, I understood how corporate billing systems operated. I navigated straight to the vendor and corporate events section of their website. I bypassed the glowing testimonials and photo galleries, searching directly for their standard contractual agreements. I found a downloadable PDF outlining their event policies and opened it. I scrolled down to page 4, scanning the dense text, until I found Section 7 payment terms. The stipulations were strict and unforgiving, designed to protect the venue from last-minute cancellations. A non-refundable deposit was required to secure the date, but the massive final balance was handled through an automated processing gateway. The contract stated in bold lettering that the final payment of $45,000 would be automatically drafted from the primary card on file exactly 72 hours prior to the scheduled rehearsal dinner. The clause that followed was even more crucial. It stated that failure to secure these funds upon the automated draft would result in an immediate, irrevocable cancellation of all venue services, staff, and catering. I glanced at the digital clock in the corner of my monitor, then pulled up my calendar. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for Friday evening. I traced the days backward. That meant the automated system at the Grand Bellevue was programmed to ping the payment gateway on Tuesday. I did the math in my head. Tomorrow afternoon, an automated server would attempt to pull $45,000 from an account that I had just locked down and flagged for federal fraud. The transaction would instantly bounce. The venue's financial software would trigger an alert. The domino effect was already set in motion, programmed into a server I did not even have to touch. I closed the PDF and shut my laptop. The gentle hum of the machine powered down, leaving my home office in total heavy silence. I pushed my chair back and stood up, rolling my shoulders to release the tension of the morning. I walked quietly down the hallway and peeked into Leo's bedroom. He was sleeping deeply, his breathing steady and calm beneath his favorite weighted blanket. I smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression, replacing the cold calculation of the past hour. I walked into my own bedroom, changed into comfortable pajamas, and slipped beneath my covers. I adjusted my pillows, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of calm wash over me. There was no anxiety about the upcoming confrontation. There was no lingering guilt about family loyalty. I set my alarm, reached over to turn off the bedside lamp, and closed my eyes. I went to sleep peacefully, resting better than I had in months. The ticking clock had officially begun. In exactly 3 days, the silent financial guillotine would drop straight down onto Madison's perfect fairy tale. Tuesday afternoon arrived precisely on schedule. Inside the pristine administrative offices of the Grand Bellevue, an automated billing software initiated its scheduled batch of transactions. The system reached the file for Madison and Jamal's wedding, queued up the final $45,000 balance, and pinged the payment gateway. The response was instantaneous. The digital transaction bounced. An error code flashed across the screen of the venue coordinator. It did not indicate a standard limit restriction or a simple network timeout. The code flagged the transaction as permanently blocked due to a severe fraud lockdown. The venue coordinator picked up the phone to call the bride. Across town, Madison and our mother Brenda were lounging in thick cotton robes at a luxury day spa. They were sipping cucumber water and waiting for their hot stone massages. When Madison's phone rang with the Grand Bellevue caller ID, she answered with a breezy musical tone, completely expecting a final confirmation on the seating chart. Instead, the coordinator explained the payment failure. The tone of the venue staff was relentlessly polite but undeniably firm. The funds had not cleared. Madison laughed it off immediately. She assured the coordinator it was just a silly banking glitch, probably a fraud alert triggered by such a large purchase. She put the phone on speaker and told the venue to try running the card again manually. The coordinator entered the 16 digits of my stolen profile. The system rejected it immediately. The terminal spit back a hard decline, instructing the merchant to confiscate the card and contact the issuer. The coordinator relayed this information, her voice dropping an octave, as she gently reminded Madison of their ironclad contract. The venue required the final payment exactly 72 hours before the rehearsal dinner, or all services, catering, and staff would be completely canceled. The blood drained from Madison's face. She looked at Brenda in sheer panic. Brenda grabbed the phone, demanding the coordinator try a different card, rapidly reading off the numbers for the other 2 platinum accounts they had fraudulently opened in my name. Both cards were hit with the exact same hard decline. The bank had erected an impenetrable wall around my stolen identity. Brenda ended the call, her relaxing spa day completely forgotten. They scrambled into their street clothes, their previous arrogance dissolving into raw, frantic desperation. They needed the accounts unblocked, and they needed it done instantly. They assumed they simply needed me to call the bank and verify the charges. While their fabricated world began to crumble, I was standing in a glass-walled conference room on the 20th floor of my downtown Seattle office building. I was leading a high-stakes tech presentation for our quarterly product launch. My phone was resting face down on the mahogany conference table. About halfway through my slide deck, the device began to vibrate. It buzzed against the hardwood surface. Then it vibrated again, and again. It was a relentless mechanical buzzing that threatened to distract the entire room. I did not flinch. I did not apologize. I seamlessly continued my presentation, clicking through data charts and explaining user interface upgrades with absolute focus. The phone literally danced across the table, driven by the sheer volume of incoming calls. When the meeting concluded and the stakeholders filed out of the room with satisfied nods, I finally picked up the device. The screen was a chaotic wall of notifications. There were 68 missed calls. Most were from Brenda, with a dozen from Madison thrown into the mix. I opened my messages. The text log was a wall of capital letters and exclamation points. The most recent message from Brenda read, "Riley, call me now. There is a glitch with your sister's account. I must speak with you immediately." They still thought they were in control. They honestly believed I was just unaware of the situation and would gladly call the bank to clear up a simple security flag. They thought they could just order me to fix the glitch so they could continue spending my ruined credit. I read the frantic texts with absolute zero emotion. I tapped the power button, plunging the screen into darkness, and walked back to my personal desk. I poured myself a glass of cold water and reviewed some coding reports, deliberately letting their panic stew. Brenda realized her phone calls were going into a black hole. Silence was something she had never tolerated from me. Whenever she demanded attention, she expected immediate compliance. The realization that I was actively ignoring her must have sent her completely over the edge. She abandoned Madison at the spa and drove her luxury SUV straight into the heart of downtown Seattle. She was not going to wait for a return phone call. She was going to drag me out of my office and force me to fix her massive financial problem. 30 minutes later, the sleek black phone on my desk chimed with an internal call. I picked up the receiver. It was the head of building security from the main lobby. The guard sounded highly uncomfortable. He informed me that there was a woman at the front desk claiming to be my mother. He reported that she was visibly agitated, pacing the marble floor and loudly demanding that I be brought down immediately to handle a massive banking emergency. She was refusing to leave the premises and was beginning to cause a significant scene in front of our corporate clients. The guard asked if he should call the local authorities to have her escorted off the property. I looked out the window at the Seattle skyline, feeling the solid ground of truth beneath my feet. The trap had sprung exactly as I calculated. The financial cutoff had driven her straight into the open, forcing her to abandon her polite suburban facade and act like a chaotic liability in a professional setting. I thanked the security guard for his patience. I told him not to call the police just yet. I smoothed my tailored blazer, straightened my posture, and told him I would be down in exactly 2 minutes to handle the situation personally. The elevator doors glided open, releasing me into the expansive glass-walled lobby of my company headquarters. The afternoon sunlight poured across the polished marble floors, but the serene corporate atmosphere had been thoroughly shattered. There, pacing aggressively near the reception desk, was my mother. Brenda was a spectacle of misplaced entitlement. She wore a pristine cream-colored Chanel trench coat and carried a quilted leather handbag that I knew for an absolute fact cost upwards of $4,000. It was entirely funded by the stolen platinum cards she and Madison had illegally opened in my name. The sheer audacity of her standing in my workplace, draped in the spoils of her felony, ignited a cold fire in my chest. She spotted me instantly. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she marched toward me, her face contorted in a mask of furious indignation. She did not bother to lower her voice. She did not care who was watching. She launched directly into a vicious verbal assault, her words echoing off the high glass ceilings. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. She screamed that I was a bitter, jealous sister trying to sabotage the most important week of Madison's life. She accused me of throwing a tantrum simply because I was uninvited, claiming I had deliberately hacked into their banking accounts to create a fake glitch. Her voice grew shriller with every accusation. She ordered me to march right back upstairs, get on the phone with the bank, and authorize the final venue payment before Madison suffered a nervous breakdown. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. She was attempting to rewrite reality, positioning herself and Madison as the victims of my supposed malicious jealousy, completely ignoring the fact that she was currently demanding I unblock a stolen credit line. I stood perfectly still, letting her hysterical tirade wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. The security guards hovered nervously nearby, waiting for my signal to intervene. I held up a single hand, stopping my mother mid-sentence. Her mouth snapped shut, shocked by my absolute lack of compliance. She expected me to cower. She expected me to drag myself into a defensive argument to justify my actions to her. I did none of those things. I looked her dead in the eye. The silence between us was heavy and absolute. When I finally spoke, my voice was devoid of any emotion. It was flat, clinical, and completely terrifying in its composure. I told her there was no glitch. I explained that the banking system operated exactly as it was designed to function when a massive fraud alert was triggered. I watched her eyes widen as I delivered the final blow. I stated clearly that the credit cards were locked permanently due to an active ongoing investigation for felony identity theft. I leaned in slightly, ensuring she heard every single syllable. I suggested she stop screaming in my corporate lobby and start looking for a very aggressive criminal defense attorney because the bank possessed her home address, her forged signatures, and a complete paper trail of her theft. The color drained from Brenda's face with alarming speed. Her previously flushed cheeks turned a sickly shade of gray. The manufactured outrage completely evaporated, replaced by genuine suffocating terror. She stumbled backward, her expensive handbag slipping from her shoulder to hang awkwardly from her elbow. She opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps spin another lie or beg for mercy, but no sound came out. Before she could recover her footing, a deep, resonant voice echoed from the shadowed seating area across the lobby. Identity theft. What fraud are you talking about? A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out from behind a large decorative planter. It was Jamal Madison's wealthy, successful fiancé. At 32, Jamal was a commanding presence. He was a brilliant African-American entrepreneur who had built a massive chain of high-end restaurants from the ground up. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried an aura of quiet authority that instantly dominated the room. He had been sitting silently in the waiting area the entire time. Jamal slowly approached us, his sharp gaze locked entirely on my mother. He explained his presence with a dangerous calm. He had driven Brenda to my office because she had been acting erratically all morning. She had claimed there was a minor family dispute over wedding logistics that she needed to smooth over with me. Jamal had immediately sensed that the family was hiding something massive, something rotten beneath their perfect suburban facade. He had offered to drive her, insisting he wanted to help resolve the tension. In reality, he had come to observe, and he had just heard exactly what he needed to hear. Brenda was hyperventilating now. She frantically reached out to grab Jamal's arm, stammering out disjointed excuses. She tried to tell him it was all a misunderstanding, a terrible banking error, a silly mix-up between sisters that Riley was blowing completely out of proportion. She begged him not to listen to me. Jamal did not even look at her. He smoothly sidestepped her grasping hands, bypassing her entirely, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. He walked directly up to me. The power dynamic in the lobby shifted instantly and permanently. Brenda was no longer the matriarch demanding obedience. She was a frantic, exposed criminal entirely sidelined by the two people who actually held the cards. Jamal looked down at me, assessing my steady posture and cold expression. He saw right through the chaos my mother had tried to create. He extended his hand, introducing himself properly, for the first time noting that Madison had always kept our interactions incredibly brief and superficial. I shook his hand, feeling the solid, respectful weight of his grip. He did not ask me to calm down. He did not ask me to explain myself in front of an audience. He simply stated that he needed to understand exactly what was happening with the finances for his own wedding. He asked if I would be willing to speak with him privately, away from the noise and the lies. I nodded, entirely ready to pull back the curtain on the woman he was about to marry. The trap had closed and Jamal was finally awake. I led Jamal past the security turnstiles, leaving my mother sputtering incoherently near the reception desk. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind us, cutting off her shrill protests and the bewildered stares of the lobby staff. We crossed the busy downtown street in complete silence. The overcast Seattle sky perfectly matched the gravity of the moment. We entered a quiet, dimly lit artisanal coffee shop on the corner. The barista wiped down the espresso machine, ignoring us as we bypassed the counter entirely and claimed a secluded leather booth in the far back. Jamal sat across from me. He folded his large hands on the reclaimed wood table. His tailored suit seemed at odds with his tense, exhausted posture. He looked at me with an expression of sheer bewilderment. He bypassed all pleasantries and demanded the absolute truth. He stated that he had personally wired Madison $80,000 in cash 3 months ago. It was his exact half of the wedding budget, intended to cover the venue, the catering, and the extravagant floral arrangements she insisted upon for the reception. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He asked me why my credit cards were involved in paying for his wedding when he had fully funded it himself. I did not give him a verbal explanation. The sheer magnitude of Madison's deception required undeniable proof. I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out my laptop. I opened the screen, logged into my secure banking portal, and turned the device around to face him. I guided his eyes to the 3 platinum credit card accounts freshly stamped with bright red fraud alerts. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I pointed out the dates the accounts were opened, all originating within the last 8 months. I highlighted the billing address, which perfectly matched my parents' suburban home. Then I pulled up the itemized transaction history. I watched Jamal's jaw tighten as he read the charges. He saw the Vera Wang boutique charge. He saw the high-end caterer deposits. He saw the massive pending charge for the Grand Bellevue that had just bounced. I explained the mechanics of the identity theft. I told him how my parents had kept my old financial documents in their attic and handed over my social security number to fund Madison's luxury aesthetic. I laid out the math for him. If my stolen credit was currently carrying $120,000 in wedding expenses, then Madison had never touched a single cent of the $80,000 he had transferred to her. She had pocketed his money entirely. She was hoarding his cash in a private offshore account while deliberately destroying my financial future to pay for her grand performance. Jamal stared at the screen for a long time. The ambient noise of the coffee shop faded into the background. I could practically see the calculations running through his mind. He was a highly successful restaurateur, a man who built an empire by reading people and managing complex business finances. The realization that he had been conned by the woman sleeping beside him hit him like a physical blow. He rubbed his temples, his breathing turning shallow. He muttered that she had shown him receipts. I countered instantly, stating that Madison was a master of curating false realities. She had fabricated digital invoices to keep him completely pacified while she actively siphoned his wealth. He shook his head, struggling to align the sweet, loving fiancée he knew with the calculating fraudster exposed on the glowing screen between us. He asked how a family could possibly support something so vicious. He asked why my own parents would help her destroy me. That was the perfect moment to reveal the core of the issue. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I unlocked it and opened the family group chat. I scrolled up to the exact message that had severed my ties with them forever. I placed the phone gently on the table next to the laptop. I told him to read it. Jamal picked up the device. He read the message from Madison explicitly banning me from the wedding. He read the sentence where she stated I would ruin everything. And then he read the final damning instruction to leave my weird kid at home. I watched his thumb hover over the screen as he noticed the two red heart icons beneath the message signifying Brenda and Thomas's enthusiastic approval of the banishment. Jamal placed the phone face down on the table. His expression shifted from shock to pure, visceral disgust. He looked at me, his eyes dark with sudden, immense sorrow. He revealed something Madison clearly never bothered to learn about him. He told me he had a 6-year-old nephew with severe autism. He said he adored that little boy more than anything in the world. He spent his weekends helping his sister navigate therapies and sensory challenges. The ableism, the sheer, unapologetic cruelty of Madison referring to a child on the spectrum as a weird kid completely shattered whatever lingering affection he held for her. The financial theft was a massive betrayal, but the attack on my son was an unforgivable character flaw. A heavy, loaded silence settled between us. We sat in the booth, two capable, successful people, realizing we had been targeted by a deeply toxic family. Jamal leaned back against the leather cushion. He stated that he could easily drive back to their shared penthouse right now, pack his bags, and cancel the wedding with a single phone call. He could end it immediately. But as he looked at the banking statements and the cruel text message, a different kind of resolve hardened his features. A simple cancellation was too quiet. It allowed Madison to play the victim. It allowed Brenda and Thomas to spin a false narrative to their social circle about cold feet or a sudden misunderstanding. Jamal leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with chilling clarity. He did not want to let them off the hook in private. He asked me exactly when the venue would officially terminate their services due to the bounced payment. I informed him that the final deadline expired exactly at the start of the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. Jamal nodded slowly, a calculated, brilliant strategy forming in his mind. We forged an unspoken alliance right there over the empty coffee cups. We decided to maintain absolute radio silence. We would let Brenda panic. We would let Madison continue living in her fabricated bubble of luxury. We would let them put on their designer clothes, gather their wealthy friends, and walk directly into the venue tomorrow night. We set the stage for the ultimate public reckoning. Jamal pulled his sleek smartphone from the interior pocket of his suit jacket and placed it flat on the reclaimed wood table. He opened his message thread with Madison. The screen displayed dozens of unanswered, frantic texts she had fired off over the last hour. He stared at her name at the top of the screen, his jaw set in a hard line. He tapped the glass, his fingers hovering over the digital keyboard as he typed out the exact lie we had just meticulously crafted. "Don't worry, babe. I sorted the card issue out with the bank. Everything is fine. See you at the rehearsal dinner tonight." He did not add an emoji. He hit send immediately, locked the screen, and slid the phone back into his pocket. It was done. The bait was officially in the water. Across town, inside the sterile, hyper-illuminated environment of a luxury downtown nail salon, Madison and Brenda were vibrating with a toxic mixture of panic and rage. They were seated in plush leather massage chairs, their hands soaking in warm rose petal water, frantically trying to maintain their composed, wealthy facades in front of the salon staff. When Madison's phone chimed with Jamal's customized text tone, she snatched it up with wet fingers, nearly dropping the device into the basin. Her eyes scanned the brief message. A massive, genuine sigh of relief escaped her lips, loud enough to draw irritated glances from the other affluent patrons. She shoved the glowing screen directly into Brenda's face. The rigid, terrified tension immediately evaporated from my mother's shoulders. She flagged down a salon attendant and haughtily ordered 2 glasses of complimentary champagne to celebrate. They clinked their crystal flutes together, absolutely convinced they had successfully manipulated the situation and survived the crisis. Madison laughed a bright, triumphant, and utterly hollow sound, dismissing my earlier resistance as a pathetic bluff. They spent the next 2 hours getting $100 manicures, openly mocking my supposed attempt to ruin their prestigious week. They eagerly convinced themselves that Jamal's immense wealth and corporate influence had simply steamrolled over my petty banking dispute. They assumed I had been intimidated into submission by his intervention, or that Jamal had effortlessly paid the venue balance in cash to bypass the frozen accounts. In their arrogant minds, I was put firmly back in my place, defeated and silenced, while they remained completely untouchable. While my toxic family preened and polished themselves for their high society debut, I walked straight to the Central Seattle Police Precinct. I was not leaving a single detail of this reckoning to chance. I bypassed the standard patrol desk, requested to speak directly with the Financial Crimes Division, and was escorted through a maze of secure doors to a small, brightly lit office. I sat down with Detective Vance, a seasoned investigator specializing in corporate fraud and aggravated identity theft. I opened my laptop on his metal desk and presented the digital affidavit, the permanent freeze confirmations provided by Agent Miller, and the time-stamped fraudulent transaction logs. I handed over neatly printed copies of the Vera Wang receipts, the floral deposits, and the massive pending contract for the Grand Bellevue. Detective Vance reviewed the staggering dollar amounts, his professional skepticism quickly shifting into sharp, focused attention. I explained that the perpetrators of this $120,000 felony were not anonymous digital hackers operating from a basement halfway across the globe. I looked him dead in the eye and told him they were my own mother and sister. Furthermore, I provided him with their exact geographical location for that very evening. I handed over the pristine gold-embossed invitation to the rehearsal dinner, detailing the address of the Grand Bellevue and the precise schedule of events. I mapped out exactly how the venue's automated payment system was programmed to fail in just a few hours, setting the stage for their immediate, undeniable exposure. I formally authorized the police department to coordinate directly with Agent Miller's federal fraud unit at the bank. Detective Vance made a series of rapid recorded phone calls, officially verifying the locked status of the platinum accounts and confirming the severity of the identity theft. Within 45 minutes, the sting operation was officially sanctioned. A plainclothes unit was assigned to stand by at the venue perimeter, waiting for the venue management to trigger the inevitable disturbance call. The trap was locked, fully backed by law enforcement, completely sealing Brenda and Madison into the devastating consequences of their own actions. While I secured the legal snare, Jamal executed his own flawless, systematic departure. He drove his car back to the sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse he shared with Madison. The massive apartment was practically vibrating with her shallow presence, cluttered with glossy bridal magazines, expensive fabric swatches, and the excessive designer shopping bags she had greedily accumulated over the past 6 months using my stolen identity. He bypassed it all with cold efficiency. Moving with silent, methodical precision, he entered his private study and began packing his belongings. He did not pack everything. He only gathered his absolute essentials. He loaded his tailored suits, his collection of vintage watches, and a heavy fireproof lockbox containing his critical personal documents into a set of sleek leather duffel bags. He left all of Madison's belongings completely untouched. Her side of the massive walk-in closet remained full of stolen luxury. Her expensive skincare products remained neatly lined up on the marble bathroom vanity. He was not interested in a messy emotional division of property or a dramatic screaming match in the hallway. He was executing a surgical, permanent strike. Once his bags were packed and staged near the private elevator, Jamal sat at his mahogany desk and initiated an impenetrable financial firewall. He logged into his corporate banking portals and swiftly moved his core assets. He completely severed Madison's access to any fragment of his wealth, immediately revoking her authorized user status on his secondary accounts and permanently freezing the joint checking account they had opened for minor household expenses. He called his wealth manager, instructing the firm to monitor all personal and corporate accounts for any unauthorized withdrawal attempts and to deny any requests made by his former fiancée. Within an hour, Jamal had effectively erased his financial footprint from her life, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the impending fallout of her own monumental fraud. He carried his bags into the elevator, pressing the button for the underground parking garage. He drove his car out of the building, leaving the penthouse perfectly intact, a silent, empty museum dedicated to a completely fabricated relationship. He navigated the Seattle traffic toward a discreet downtown hotel, securing a private executive suite for the night. He hung his suit for the evening, straightened his tie, and mentally prepared himself for the final act. The crystal chandeliers of Laura, downtown Seattle's most exclusive five-star restaurant, cast a brilliant golden hue over the sprawling private dining room. Waitstaff in pristine white jackets glided seamlessly between the densely packed tables, pouring vintage champagne into imported crystal flutes and serving delicate truffle appetizers. The room was draped in heavy silk linens with towering, extravagant arrangements of white orchids and imported hydrangeas serving as centerpieces. A live string quartet played softly in the corner. It was a suffocating, grandiose display of extreme wealth, an entire evening fabricated on a foundation of felony fraud. At the head table, Thomas tapped his silver knife against his glass, commanding the immediate attention of the room. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of his custom tuxedo, and launched into a nauseatingly self-congratulatory speech. He spoke of Madison as if she were a divine being descended from the heavens. He praised her supposed grace, her unparalleled success, and her flawless character. He painted a picture of a devoted daughter who had worked tirelessly to achieve her dreams. Brenda followed immediately after, dabbing at invisible tears with a lace handkerchief. She projected her voice to ensure every corner of the vast room heard her declare Madison the perfect golden daughter. Brenda called her the absolute pride of the family, the shining standard they all aspired to, and a woman of uncompromising integrity. The hypocrisy hanging in the air was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Over 100 high society guests filled the room, hanging on every fabricated word. The guest list was heavily skewed toward Jamal's highly respected and influential family, including his parents, prominent business partners from across the country, and a dozen local politicians. Jamal's mother, a formidable matriarch, known for her sharp intuition, sat at the front table in an elegant gown, watching the proceedings with a warm but observant gaze. These were dignified, elegant people who genuinely valued hard work, community, and honesty. They clapped politely, smiling warmly at the seemingly flawless couple seated at the center of the room. They raised their glasses in a unified, joyful toast, completely oblivious to the fact that the lavish spread before them, the very chairs they sat on, and the champagne they were drinking were entirely funded by a stolen Social Security number. Jamal sat beside Madison, a rigid, unreadable smile plastered on his face. He nodded at his father across the room, playing his part with terrifying precision as he waited for the exact right moment. The heavy mahogany double doors at the rear of the dining hall swung open with a resounding heavy thud. The sudden movement caught the attention of the back tables, and a ripple of total silence began to spread forward, cutting through the polite chatter like a blade. I stepped into the warm light of the room. I did not wear a subdued pastel bridesmaid dress, or attempt to fade into the background. I wore a razor-sharp tailored emerald green power suit that fit flawlessly, paired with stiletto heels that clicked with absolute unyielding authority against the polished hardwood floor. Beside me, My son Leo held my hand firmly. He looked incredibly handsome, in a miniature navy blazer, wearing his sleek, black noise-canceling headphones to comfortably manage the loud environment. We walked forward together, our heads held high, completely shattering the meticulously curated illusion my family had constructed. The color drained from Madison's face the absolute second her eyes locked onto mine. Her picture-perfect blushing bride smile twisted into an ugly feral sneer of pure rage. She shoved her chair back so violently that it screeched against the floor and nearly toppled over. She marched directly toward us, her silk gown swishing angrily around her ankles. She closed the distance in seconds, intercepting us halfway down the center aisle, far enough from the head table to keep her voice down. She leaned in close, her face flushed with fury, her voice a vicious, venomous hiss meant only for my ears. She demanded to know what I was doing there, her eyes darting nervously toward Jamal's family to ensure they could not hear her vitriol. She ordered me to turn around and get out immediately, declaring that I had absolutely no right to taint her high-class exclusive event with my presence. She sneered directly at Leo, her upper lip curling in disgust, and repeated her hateful demand to remove my weird kid from her sight before she had us both physically thrown onto the street. Leo squeezed my hand, completely unfazed by her manic energy, protected by his headphones and my unwavering presence. Behind her, Brenda was already out of her seat, frantically gesturing for the restaurant's private security detail to converge on our position. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, ready to shout to the room that I was an unhinged, uninvited trespasser, trying to ruin her daughter's special night. The guards at the perimeter of the room began to move forward, their expressions tense. Before the guards could even take a single step, a massive figure moved swiftly through the crowd. Jamal materialized, instantly striding down the aisle with long, purposeful steps. He stepped directly between me and my furious sister. He turned his broad back to Madison, physically and symbolically shielding Leo and me from her hostility. He did not look at his bride. He did not ask her to calm down or try to de-escalate the situation privately. Instead, he reached over to the nearby presentation podium, his large hand wrapping firmly around the wireless microphone. The low, sharp hum of feedback echoed through the dining hall as he flipped the power switch. The remaining chatter in the room instantly died. The clinking of silverware stopped. The string quartet lowered their bows. Every single eye in the five-star restaurant locked onto the groom. Madison froze, her mouth hanging open in confusion. Brenda halted mid-stride, her hands still raised in the air. Jamal stood tall, his posture radiating absolute authority, and raised the microphone directly to his mouth. "Good evening, everyone." Jamal's deep voice boomed through the high-end audio system, echoing off the dark mahogany panels and imported crystal chandeliers. The sudden immense amplification made Brenda physically flinch and freeze in her tracks. "Please direct your undivided attention to the main screen behind the head table. My beautiful bride-to-be arranged a romantic photo montage for us tonight to celebrate our journey together. I decided to make a few critical last-minute edits to the presentation." He gestured with his free hand toward the massive motorized projector screen slowly descending from the ornate ceiling. Madison turned around, a triumphant, albeit highly confused smile, fighting to return to her face. She expected a meticulously curated slideshow of their exotic vacations, their lavish engagement party, and their perfectly filtered life. Instead, the high-definition laser projector blasted a stark, blindingly white document onto the canvas. It was a sworn bank fraud affidavit, bearing the official seal of a major federal financial institution. Beside it sat a platinum credit card statement. The name printed clearly on the account was Riley's. The billing address, however, perfectly matched Brenda and Thomas's suburban residence. The collective intake of breath from over 100 high society guests was audible even over the ambient hum of the restaurant's HVAC system. Jamal did not pause to let the audience recover. He paced slowly in front of the head table, the microphone held steadily near his lips, delivering his narration with the chilling, detached precision of a prosecuting attorney, delivering a final closing argument. 3 months ago, I transferred exactly $80,000 in cash to Madison, Jamal stated, pointing directly at the projected banking statements. That money was intended to cover my half of the expenses for our upcoming wedding. He paused, letting the immense figure settle over the silent crowd. His wealthy colleagues and family members nodded slightly, recognizing the standard financial arrangements of a high-profile merger. However, my money was never used to secure this five-star venue. It was never used to pay for the imported orchids on your tables or the vintage champagne currently in your glasses. Madison routed my funds into a private offshore holding account for her own personal accumulation. A low, rumbling murmur of shock swept through the dining hall. Several prominent businessmen in Jamal's inner circle set their drinks down, their faces darkening with immediate disapproval. Madison was shaking her head frantically, mouthing the word no to the empty air, completely paralyzed by the glaring evidence magnifying her crimes tenfold behind her. Jamal pressed a small remote clicker hidden in his palm. The slide transitioned. The screen flooded with rows of itemized transactions. A Vera Wang bridal salon charge, the Grand Bellevue security deposit, a luxury event catering service invoice. He kept his gaze locked on the audience, his voice slicing through the rising tension. To fund the illusion of this wedding, my flawless bride and her respectable parents orchestrated a highly coordinated identity theft ring. Jamal continued, his tone turning absolutely lethal. They utilized Riley's stolen Social Security number to open multiple fraudulent credit lines, racking up over $120,000 in felony debt while actively trying to ruin her financial future. They did this while smiling in your faces and accepting your generous congratulations. Brenda let out a strangled, breathless shriek. She lunged toward the stage, frantically waving her arms at the audiovisual technician enclosed in the sound booth above. She ordered him to cut the power, demanding he turn the projector off immediately to stop the presentation. The technician, who had been heavily compensated by Jamal earlier that afternoon, simply crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and completely ignored her hysterical commands. Thomas sat frozen at the head table, his face buried deep in his hands, fully comprehending that his lifelong facade of suburban superiority was actively disintegrating in front of the city's elite. Jamal clicked the remote one final time. The financial documents vanished. In their place, massive high-contrast screenshots of a family group chat illuminated the room. The text bubbles were blown up to 10 feet tall, making the vicious words impossible for anyone to ignore or misinterpret. Jamal read the messages aloud, his voice dropping the clinical detachment and adopting a raw, visceral edge. He highlighted Madison's demand that Riley be banned from the wedding. He read her statement that her own sister was an embarrassment to their image. And then he read the final damning sentence where Madison referred to Leo standing quietly right beside me as a weird kid who would ruin her aesthetic. The reaction from the audience was immediate and explosive. Jamal pointed directly at his own parents seated at the front table. He spoke of his 6-year-old nephew, a brilliant, beautiful child on the autism spectrum whom his entire family cherished endlessly. He described the absolute sickening disgust he felt discovering the woman he intended to marry harbored such blatant, unapologetic bigotry toward neurodivergent children. He stated clearly that stealing his money was a severe, punishable crime, but attacking an innocent, disabled child was a fatal rot of the soul. Jamal's father stood up first. The commanding patriarch of their family pushed his heavy chair back, his face set in a mask of absolute revulsion. He looked directly at Thomas, shaking his head in silent, complete condemnation. A second later, Jamal's mother stood beside her husband. Within moments, Jamal's entire extended family, his business partners and their respective spouses, rose to their feet in unified, unyielding solidarity. They stood in complete silence, their collective posture entirely rejecting the toxic family cowering at the front of the room. The absolute rejection from the very high society tier Madison and Brenda had spent their lives trying to infiltrate was physically crushing. Madison finally broke her paralysis. She scrambled forward, her expensive silk dress catching on the edge of a dining chair, sobbing uncontrollably. She reached her hands out toward Jamal, begging him to listen, claiming the screenshots were taken out of context, swearing she could explain the offshore accounts and the text messages. She pleaded with him not to throw away their perfect love over a stupid, petty misunderstanding with her sister. Jamal did not flinch. He did not step backward to avoid her grasp. He simply stared down at the pathetic exposed fraud weeping before him. He reached into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out the massive, flawless $30,000 diamond engagement ring she had left sitting on her vanity that morning. He held it up under the glare of the chandeliers, letting the intricate facets catch the light one final time. Beside him on a small cocktail table sat a half-full glass of vintage champagne abandoned by a fleeing guest. Jamal extended his arm over the table. He opened his fingers. The heavy platinum band plummeted downward, hitting the champagne with a sharp, distinct splash. The expensive diamond sank rapidly to the bottom of the crystal flute, surrounded by a steady stream of rising golden bubbles. He brought the microphone back to his mouth, his voice echoing with absolute devastating finality. "There will be no wedding. I don't marry felons." The clink of the heavy platinum band settling against the bottom of the crystal flute rang out like a final judge's gavel. Madison stared at the bubbling champagne, her mind completely short-circuiting. The realization that Jamal was actually leaving, that the $80,000, the penthouse, and the prestige were evaporating before her very eyes shattered her paralysis. She let out a guttural, ear-piercing shriek that forced several guests in the front row to physically recoil in their seats. She spun away from Jamal and turned her manic, terrified gaze directly onto me. She began to thrash her arms, pointing a trembling, manicured finger in my direction, desperate to reclaim the narrative through sheer volume. She screamed to the silent, horrified room that I was a pathological liar. Her voice cracked as she wept violently, shaking her head and pleading with the crowd. She claimed I was a deeply jealous, vindictive sister who had spent my entire adult life trying to sabotage her happiness. She yelled that I was a master hacker, that I had illegally accessed her personal computers and financial records to forge those banking documents just to ruin her perfect night. She begged Jamal's family to look at me, painting me as a deranged, bitter outcast who had fabricated a massive federal crime simply because I could not handle being excluded from her glamorous social circle. She cried that I was the real criminal, pleading with the wealthy audience to believe that her hands were entirely clean and that she was the victim of an elaborate, cruel setup. She inhaled deeply to continue her hysterical tirade, preparing to spin another web of frantic, disjointed excuses, but the words died instantly in her throat. A harsh, pulsing glow abruptly interrupted the warm, golden ambiance of the five-star dining room. Brilliant flashes of violent red and piercing blue light began strobing aggressively against the tall, floor-to-ceiling restaurant windows. The rhythmic, deafening wail of multiple police sirens cut through the quiet city street outside, growing exponentially louder until the vehicles screeched to a halt directly at the valet curb. The harsh, rotating lights bounced off the imported crystal chandeliers and illuminated Madison's terrified, tear-streaked face in alternating flashes of crimson and cobalt. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the hall burst open for the second time that evening. 4 uniformed police officers, flanked by 2 plainclothes detectives wearing heavy tactical vests over their dress shirts, marched into the room. They moved with absolute, uncompromising authority. They bypassed the stunned waitstaff and brushed past the bewildered maitre d', who had hopelessly tried to intercept them in the lobby. Their heavy tactical boots thudded loudly against the polished hardwood floors, creating a sharp, intimidating rhythm that instantly killed any remaining whispers in the room. Detective Vance, the seasoned investigator I had spoken with at the precinct just hours earlier, led the formation. He did not hesitate or look around at the lavish decor. He walked straight down the center aisle, his eyes scanning the head table until he locked onto his targets. Detective Vance stopped 10 feet from where my family stood, frozen in sheer terror. He held up a thick manila folder, his voice carrying the unmistakable booming cadence of law enforcement. He demanded that Madison Brenda and Thomas Step forward immediately. He announced to the dead silent room that he held active, signed warrants for their arrest. He cited the charges with absolute clarity, ensuring every high society guest, every politician, and every single member of Jamal's highly respected family heard the exact legal terminology. He stated they were being detained for multiple counts of aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, and felony credit card fraud. The final shred of Brenda's carefully curated country club facade violently ripped away. Her face turned a blotchy, mottled crimson. She lost all sense of decorum, acting purely on desperate, arrogant instinct. She lunged forward physically, throwing her body between Detective Vance and her weeping daughter. She held her hands up her expensive silk shawl, slipping off her shoulders to the floor, and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded the officers turn around and leave the private event immediately. She shrieked that they were making a catastrophic mistake, aggressively threatening to call the mayor, the police commissioner, and the city council to have them all fired. She yelled that they were respectable, wealthy citizens, a family of immense social standing, and that they could not be subjected to this kind of aggressive working-class harassment. It was a breathtaking display of raw, unhinged entitlement. Brenda was literally attempting to pull rank on federal felony warrants while wearing a designer gown purchased with stolen funds. Detective Vance simply stared at her, entirely unmoved by her hysterical name-dropping and flailing arms. Behind him, the uniformed officers unclipped their handcuffs, the sharp metallic rattle sounding exceptionally loud in the cavernous room. The entire assembly of elite guests watched the spectacle in absolute breathless silence. No one gasped. No one murmured. They simply stared in complete, utter revulsion. Jamal's parents remained perfectly still, their expressions carved from stone as they watched the embarrassing display. The pristine, sophisticated image my parents had spent decades cultivating the illusion of suburban superiority. They had weaponized against me. My entire life was shattering into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the exact audience they desperately wanted to impress. Thomas finally moved. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to pull Brenda away from the detectives. His face was ashen, drained of all blood, and arrogance radiating total defeat. He knew it was over. The offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the stolen credit lines, it had all caught up to them, simultaneously cornering them in a room full of the city's elite. Madison slumped against the edge of the head table, her legs completely giving out as the reality of her impending incarceration fully settled into her mind. Jamal stood silently off to the side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching the criminals who had tried to con him face their ultimate ruin. I stood my ground near the center aisle, squeezing Leo's hand securely, feeling a profound, heavy sense of justice wash over the room as the officers stepped forward to make the arrests. Detective Vance signaled his team, and two officers immediately moved forward, grabbing Madison by her upper arms. The heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed sharply against the backdrop of her frantic hyperventilating. She thrashed weakly, but the officers held her firm. Her custom silk rehearsal gown, an outrageously expensive garment, meant to be photographed in front of a grand floral arch, now dragged pathetically across the floorboards. She tripped over the heavy hem, her designer heels skidding awkwardly as they steered her toward the main exit. Brenda tried to lunge after her daughter, letting out a primal wail of disbelief, but a female officer swiftly gripped her elbow, twisting her arms behind her back and securing her wrists in a swift, practiced motion. Thomas did not fight. He presented his hands submissively, his shoulders hunched inward, completely broken by the reality of his detention for grand larceny and credit card fraud. He knew the evidence was insurmountable. The officers read them their Miranda rights in a flat, monotone chorus, a stark clinical recitation that served as the final nail in the coffin of their manufactured lives. As the officers guided Thomas past the front tables, a sudden, desperate surge of panic overtook him. He dug his heels into the thick carpet and twisted his body toward Jamal's father, a man of immense corporate influence and deep legal connections. Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking and pathetic, begging the patriarch to make a phone call to arrange bail, to use his vast resources to smooth over this terrible misunderstanding. He swore he would pay back every single cent. Jamal's father did not even blink. He slowly picked up his tailored overcoat, turned his broad back to Thomas, without uttering a single syllable, and motioned for his wife to head toward the coat check. The dismissal was absolute. Seeing their leader move, the rest of the elite guests took their cue. They filed out of the dining room in a swift, silent exodus. No one offered sympathy. No one lingered to gossip. The wealthy executives, the politicians, and the high society matriarchs simply turned away from the disgrace and walked out the door. Within minutes, the sprawling, opulent restaurant was eerily empty, leaving behind only half-eaten truffle appetizers, abandoned crystal flutes, and the suffocating silence of a shattered illusion. Outside, the chaos of the arrests brought a surge of harsh noise to the venue. The flashing lights of the police cruisers cast chaotic, spinning shadows through the tall restaurant windows, and the wail of backup sirens pierced the glass. I dropped to my knees right there in the center aisle, bringing myself down to Leo's eye level. He was remarkably calm, his black noise-canceling headphones doing their job, but I could feel the slight tremor of overstimulation in his small fingers. I cupped my hands gently over the outside of his headphones, physically shielding him from the visual and auditory assault of the room. I pulled his small body into a tight, fierce embrace, burying my face in his soft hair, and whispered that we were safe now. The monsters who had tormented us were gone, and they could never hurt him again. As I stood back up, smoothing my jacket, a tall shadow fell over us. Jamal stood waiting quietly a few feet away. His face had softened from the hardened mask of vengeance into something exhausted, but genuine. He offered a slight nod, gesturing toward a discreet side exit used by the kitchen staff that bypassed the chaotic valet stand and the flashing police cruisers. He walked right beside us, using his large frame to block the view of any lingering reporters or curious onlookers gathering on the street. The night air was cool, cutting through the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. Jamal escorted us directly to my parked car, waiting patiently until Leo was securely buckled into his booster seat and my engine was running. He gave me one final look of mutual respect, a silent acknowledgement of the storm we had both just survived, before turning back to the restaurant to deal with the legal wreckage of his canceled future. The next morning dawned bright and incredibly still. It was Saturday. The exact date circled on hundreds of embossed gold foil invitations. The day Madison was supposed to walk down a rose-petal aisle and secure her stolen empire. Instead, I woke up in my own bed, wrapped in a soft, worn quilt, listening to the gentle hum of the city outside my window. The apartment was bathed in warm, peaceful sunlight. I walked into my modest kitchen, the hardwood cool against my bare feet, and filled the kettle. The rich, earthy aroma of brewing coffee filled the air, grounding me in a reality that was finally entirely mine. I poured a mug and stepped out onto my small balcony, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. Leo was still sleeping soundly, safe in his room, completely untouched by the poison of the family that had tried to erase him. Miles away, deep in the bowels of the downtown precinct, the scene was vastly different. Madison sat shivering on a rigid steel bench inside a sterile concrete holding cell. The heavy iron bars cast harsh geometric shadows across her face, under the buzzing, unflinching glare of industrial fluorescent lights. The lavish silk designer gown she had refused to take off was now stained with dirt from the police cruiser, severely wrinkled and reeking of stale sweat and despair. Her meticulous, perfectly styled hair was a tangled, matted mess hanging in her face. There were no caterers bringing her mimosas, no photographers snapping candid moments, and no adoring crowds telling her how beautiful she looked. There was only the cold, unyielding reality of cinder-block walls, the distant, terrifying echo of slamming cell doors, and the absolute certainty of the felony charges waiting for her. The perfect wedding day had arrived, delivering exactly what she had earned. While I savored my quiet morning coffee, the digital wheels of the federal banking system were turning with ruthless efficiency. The fraud affidavits I had filed days earlier, combined with the police report generated from the restaurant raid, triggered an immediate automated financial lockdown. The platinum credit lines opened under my stolen identity were officially flagged and frozen. By 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, the massive chargebacks initiated. The money did not slowly trickle out. It vanished in a catastrophic, instantaneous digital sweep. Across the city, prestigious vendors woke up to absolute financial horror. The Grand Bellevue's accounting department stared at their screens as an $80,000 venue fee was aggressively reversed, leaving a gaping void in their ledger. The boutique catering service, which had prepared truffles and Wagyu beef for over 100 guests, saw their $40,000 payment completely clawed back by the bank. The luxury florist, who had imported thousands of rare white orchids and hydrangeas, was hit with a devastating chargeback notification. These high-end vendors operated on strict margins and catered exclusively to the elite. They did not tolerate bounced checks, and they certainly did not tolerate felony fraud. Panic instantly morphed into unyielding, venomous rage. They wanted their money, and if the cash was gone, they were coming for their merchandise. Thomas had been released from the downtown precinct on his own recognizance just before dawn, leaving Brenda and Madison shivering in their holding cells while he scrambled to find a solution. He had returned to his pristine suburban home, exhausted, his bespoke tuxedo rumpled and smelling of stale police station coffee. He barely had time to pour a glass of scotch and collapse into his leather armchair before the roar of heavy diesel engines shattered the quiet morning of his exclusive neighborhood. Brenda, in her relentless pursuit of social dominance, had meticulously scheduled an extravagant post-wedding Sunday brunch to be hosted at their residence. She had arranged for the house to be transformed into a lavish floral wonderland, a continuation of the previous night's illusion. The vendors had arrived precisely on time to set up, but they were no longer there to serve. They were there to repossess. Thomas jumped at the sound of aggressive, heavy pounding on his front door. Before he could even turn the deadbolt, a furious event coordinator pushed her way inside, waving a red-stamped invoice in his face. Close behind her marched a small army of delivery men, caterers, and floral assistants. They did not ask for permission. They swarmed the property like locusts. The suburban home instantly turned into a chaotic, humiliating war zone. Workers aggressively pushed past Thomas, marching into the dining room and living areas with heavy dollies and moving crates. They began ruthlessly dismantling the towering 5-tiered crystal champagne towers Brenda had ordered for the foyer, aggressively shoving the expensive glassware into padded boxes. 2 men grabbed the massive imported silk drapery that had been hung to cover the bay windows, tearing it down and leaving the curtain rods swinging violently. The florist's team swept through the house, snatching up every single arrangement of white orchids and imported hydrangeas, dumping them unceremoniously into the backs of their idling box trucks. They hauled away everything of value that had been purchased with my stolen identity, leaving the living room a stripped, chaotic mess of trampled carpets and scattered leaves. The noise and the fleet of commercial vehicles effectively woke up the entire affluent street. The neighborhood, a collection of wealthy, gossiping socialites whom Brenda had spent years trying to dominate, stepped out onto their manicured lawns and wraparound porches. They watched in absolute stunned fascination as Thomas's home was publicly gutted. They pointed, whispered, and pulled out their phones as angry vendors shouted threats of civil lawsuits from the driveway. The pristine, highly curated image of suburban superiority that Thomas and Brenda worshipped was entirely annihilated right in front of their peers. There was nowhere to hide, no excuse left to spin. Inside the ransacked house, Thomas's phone rang incessantly. The aggressive caterers and event planners were demanding immediate cash wire transfers to cover the labor costs they had already lost, threatening to send their corporate lawyers after his personal assets by Monday morning. Simultaneously, Thomas was frantically trying to figure out how to get his wife and daughter out of county lockup. Madison's bail had been set astronomically high due to the severity of the grand larceny charges and the clear flight risk indicated by her offshore accounts. Brenda's bail was equally paralyzing. Thomas had no liquid cash. Jamal had frozen all joint business accounts, and the police had locked down everything tied to the fraudulent credit lines. Desperate Thomas drove his luxury sedan to a dingy, neon-lit bail bondsman located a block away from the precinct. The bondsman, a hardened man who preyed on the desperate, took one look at Thomas's ruined tuxedo and frantic demeanor and named his price. To secure the cash necessary to pay the bondsman and temporarily silence the loudest vendors threatening to seize his cars, Thomas had to collateralize the only asset he had left. He sat in a cramped, foul-smelling office and signed the paperwork to take out a predatory high-interest lien against his suburban home. It was a home already heavily mortgaged to fund Brenda's fake, opulent lifestyle over the years, and this new loan pushed him over the edge of a fiscal cliff. He signed his name with a shaking hand, legally binding himself to an interest rate that guaranteed his total bankruptcy. The family was officially bleeding cash by the second. They had traded their entire future, their freedom, and their social standing for a single night of fabricated glory that never even happened. The walls were closing in rapidly, and the financial ruin they had tried to force onto me was now burying them alive. Exactly 7 days after the catastrophic collapse of Madison's fabricated fairy tale, the crisp Tuesday afternoon air at Leo's specialized academy felt like a sanctuary. The school was a quiet, secure environment surrounded by towering oak trees and heavy iron gates that usually kept the chaos of the outside world at bay. I had just secured Leo safely into his booster seat, pulling the heavy safety harness across his chest and handing him his favorite sensory toy. He was completely engrossed in a colorful puzzle, blissfully isolated from the adult world. I closed the heavy rear door of my SUV, the solid metallic thud echoing pleasantly in the quiet, tree-lined parking lot. I turned around to load his backpack into the trunk, feeling a profound sense of peace. That peace was violently shattered as two dark shadows suddenly blocked the warm afternoon sun, trapping me between the open trunk and the side of my vehicle. Brenda and Thomas stood directly in my path. The physical deterioration they had suffered in just one single week was staggering. The polished, arrogant veneer they had weaponized my entire life, the country club superiority they wore like armor was entirely gone. Thomas looked 15 years older. His face was deeply gaunt, his skin a sickly pallid gray, and his jaw was covered in rough, patchy stubble. He wore a wrinkled trench coat that hung loosely over his slumped, defeated frame. Brenda was practically unrecognizable. Her perfectly coiffed, expensive hair was flat and oily. The manicured elegance had been replaced by manic, bloodshot eyes surrounded by deep, dark circles and a deeply unhinged, feral energy. They reeked of stale cigarettes, cheap coffee, and absolute desperation. Brenda did not bother with pleasantries or greetings. She stepped aggressively into my personal space, invading my boundary with a vicious, twisted sneer. She launched immediately into a brutal, calculated extortion tactic. Her voice was a harsh, venomous hiss, specifically designed to trigger every childhood insecurity and trauma I had ever harbored. She demanded that I contact the district attorney immediately and drop every single grand larceny and fraud charge against Madison. She ordered me to sign a sworn legal affidavit, assuming full responsibility for the $120,000 in credit card debt they had racked up in my name, insisting I tell the bank it was all a massive misunderstanding. When I simply stared at her, my expression completely blank and unreadable. Brenda leaned in closer, baring her teeth like a cornered animal. She laid out her ultimate devastating threat. She stated that if I did not absorb their financial ruin and clear Madison's name by Friday morning, they would file an emergency petition for full custody of Leo. She sneered, detailing exactly how they would destroy me in family court. She claimed they would hire ruthless, high-priced attorneys to paint me as mentally unstable, utilizing my past therapy sessions and childhood anxieties against me. She threatened to stand before a judge and swear under oath that I was a deeply bitter, vindictive woman who was entirely unfit to raise a special needs child. She promised to drag my name through the mud, ensuring I would be committed, and that I would never see my son again, unless I completely submitted to their demands. Thomas stood right behind her, nodding in silent cowardly agreement, fully complicit in leveraging his own vulnerable grandson as a bargaining chip to save his favorite daughter from federal prison. In the past, a threat of this magnitude from my mother would have sent me into a paralyzing, breathless panic attack. I would have crumbled, cried uncontrollably, and likely surrendered just to keep the peace and protect my child from their wrath. But standing there staring at the two pathetic, crumbling figures before me, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice, defend my parenting, or attempt to argue with their delusional blackmail. Instead, I calmly reached into the front pocket of my tailored blazer. I slowly pulled out my smartphone and tapped the screen, turning the brightness all the way up so there could be no mistaking what she was looking at. I held the device directly in front of Brenda's face. The screen displayed a high-definition audio recording application. The bright red timer had been steadily ticking upward for the last 4 minutes, capturing every single vile, extortionate syllable she had just spat at me in pristine digital clarity. I looked my mother dead in the eye, maintaining a terrifyingly steady, unyielding gaze. I thanked her profusely for the undeniable extortion evidence. I informed her, keeping my voice dangerously level, that blackmailing a primary witness in an active federal felony investigation was a severe criminal offense carrying heavy mandatory sentencing. I stated clearly that her recorded threats regarding kidnapping my son would pair wonderfully with the existing grand larceny and identity theft charges currently pending against them. The color instantly drained from Brenda's face, leaving her chalky and hollow. Her mouth opened and closed in silent, absolute horror as the realization hit her. She had just handed me the exact ammunition needed to lock her away alongside Madison. Thomas stumbled backward, his hands shaking violently, his eyes darting frantically around the parking lot as the severe legal implications of their ambush crashed down upon his shoulders. I did not give them a single moment to recover, apologize, or backpedal. I pressed a button on my key fob, unlocking the driver's door. I stated that my attorney had already filed a comprehensive permanent restraining order against all three of them earlier that morning. I advised them that if they ever came within 500 feet of me, my son or his school ever again, they would be immediately arrested for violating a court order on top of witness intimidation. I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors with a sharp, decisive click. I started the engine, ignoring the frantic, pathetic slapping of Brenda's hands against my tinted window. I put the car in drive and pulled smoothly out of the parking space. I glanced in the rearview mirror one final time. Brenda was screaming helplessly, stomping her feet on the asphalt in a full public meltdown. Thomas was trying to physically pull her away, his face buried in his hands to hide from the shame. Several teachers and parents who were walking out of the school building had stopped dead in their tracks, watching the disgraced, unhinged couple humiliate themselves in the middle of a private school parking lot. I turned up the radio, merging onto the main road, and drove away without a single ounce of regret. The heavy bass of the radio pulsed through the floorboards of my SUV as I merged onto the highway, leaving the pathetic spectacle of my parents shrinking in the rearview mirror. The adrenaline from the parking lot confrontation slowly morphed into an icy, impenetrable resolve. I knew Brenda and Thomas were desperate cornered animals, and cornered animals were unpredictable. I refused to leave my son's safety up to chance or the slow crawl of standard bureaucratic proceedings. By the time I parked in my apartment complex, my laptop was already open. I used my substantial, pristine tech salary to retain Eleanor Vance, widely known as the most ruthless, top-tier family law attorney in the state. Her retainer was exorbitant, a figure that would have made my former self flinch, but I transferred the funds without a second thought. My career provided me with a powerful financial arsenal, and I was finally ready to deploy it. I marched into Eleanor's high-rise office the next morning, handing over the parking lot, recording the police reports, and the complete digital footprint of my family's financial crimes. Eleanor did not offer false sympathy or gentle platitudes. She offered immediate, aggressive action. She drafted a legal offensive designed to absolutely crush any theoretical custody petition before my parents could even file the initial paperwork. The culmination of Eleanor's swift legal strike took place inside a hushed mahogany-paneled courtroom on a rainy Tuesday morning. Brenda and Thomas sat across the aisle, flanked by a cheap, overwhelmed public defender they had likely scraped together with the last of their liquidated assets. They looked physically diminished, their postures hollowed out by the weight of their impending criminal trials and the crushing reality of their absolute social ruin. Madison, still incarcerated and awaiting her own federal hearings, was mercifully absent. The judge, a stern, unyielding magistrate with zero tolerance for frivolous family court theatrics, stared down at the bench from behind a pair of thick reading glasses. Eleanor did not waste time with dramatic opening statements or lengthy expositions. She simply connected a small, high-end Bluetooth speaker to her tablet and pressed play on the parking lot recording. Brenda's venomous, extortionate threats echoed loudly in the cavernous courtroom. Every word about leveraging a special needs child, every threat to fabricate mental instability, and every demand to drop federal fraud charges rang out in pristine digital clarity. The judge's expression darkened into an unmistakable, furious scowl. He cut the recording off halfway through, entirely disgusted by the raw, unhinged entitlement bleeding from the speakers. Brenda opened her mouth, leaning forward to offer some twisted justification, but the judge shut down her pathetic attempt to speak with a sharp, deafening strike of his gavel. He delivered a scathing reprimand admonishing them for attempting to weaponize the family court system for criminal extortion. He ruled immediately, citing the undeniable evidence of witness intimidation and malicious intent. He granted a permanent, ironclad restraining order against Brenda Thomas and Madison. The decree was absolute and unforgiving. They were legally forbidden from coming within 1,000 feet of me, Leo, our residence, or his specialized academy. Any violation would result in immediate non-negotiable jail time. They were permanently legally banished from our existence. With the permanent restraining order filed, and the federal fraud investigation yielding official, undeniable indictments against my family, the final bureaucratic walls began to crumble. The impenetrable mountain of evidence Eleanor forwarded to the banking institutions forced an immediate total capitulation from the credit bureaus. The fraud departments officially cleared my Social Security number, issuing formal written apologies, recognizing that I was the victim of a sophisticated targeted identity theft operation. The staggering $120,000 in fabricated credit card debt, the luxury venue fees, the imported floral charges, and the designer gown purchases were officially wiped from my record. The financial stranglehold my family had tried to choke me with evaporated into thin air. Within 48 hours, the digital algorithms caught up to the legal reality. My credit score, which had been artificially tanked by their malicious spending, shot straight back up to its pristine, flawless perfection. The sudden, massive correction in my credit history was the final key required to unlock the life I had meticulously planned for my son. My loan officer, who had been holding my application in a state of suspended animation, called me with profound relief in his voice. The mortgage was fully approved at the original highly favorable interest rate. There were no more hurdles, no more fraudulent red flags, and no more shadows from my past dragging me down. I signed the closing documents in a sunlit conference room, the heavy pen moving smoothly across the thick stacks of paper. My hand was steady, and my signature was strong, securing the deed entirely under my own name. It was a hard-fought victory won through sheer endurance and unbreakable boundaries. The following weekend, a large moving truck pulled up to a beautiful, freshly painted 3-bedroom house nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was exactly what I had researched and dreamed of: heavily wooded, supremely safe, and zoned for the top-tier school district that would cater perfectly to Leo's specialized needs. I stood on the wide, welcoming front porch, inhaling the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Inside, the hardwood floors gleamed in the afternoon light, and the spacious, empty rooms waited to be filled with our actual, authentic lives. Leo ran straight through the sliding glass doors into the large, fenced-in backyard. His unfiltered laughter carried through the crisp air as he discovered a sturdy oak tree perfectly suited for a tire swing. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him freely explore his new permanent sanctuary. The toxic, suffocating grip of Brenda Thomas and Madison had been completely severed, their voices silenced by the law and their influence erased by my own independence. We were finally home, and the future was entirely ours to write. The first few weeks in our new home passed in a blissful, uninterrupted blur of unpacking boxes and establishing our new permanent routines. I spent my evenings organizing my home office, setting up a dual-monitor workstation that overlooked the quiet, tree-lined street. The ambient anxiety that used to knot my shoulders had completely vanished. I was sitting at my desk on a crisp Tuesday morning, finalizing a quarterly report for one of my primary tech clients, when my cell phone vibrated across the polished wood. The caller ID displayed Jamal's name. We had not spoken a single word to each other since the chaotic flashing lights of the restaurant parking lot, but I answered the call without a second of hesitation. Jamal's voice on the other end of the line was warm, rich, and remarkably grounded. He did not call to dwell on the past, offer unnecessary apologies, or drag me back into the emotional wreckage my family had left behind. Instead, he wanted to talk strictly about business. He asked if I had time for a secure video conference later that afternoon. When we connected on screen a few hours later, he looked sharp, focused, and entirely in his element. He sat in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom, a stark contrast to the dramatic venue where we had last crossed paths. He got straight to the point. He told me he had spent the last month quietly observing the sheer efficiency with which I had dismantled my family's elaborate fraud. He expressed a profound, genuine respect for my analytical skills, specifically praising the cold, calculated precision with which I had gathered the banking data, tracked the fraudulent expenditures, and secured the digital evidence for the authorities. He noted my absolute composure under extreme pressure, remarking that anyone who could outmaneuver a federal identity theft ring, protect her child, and maintain her professional standing without breaking a sweat was exactly the kind of person he needed in his inner circle. He transitioned seamlessly into the core of his proposition. Jamal's high-end restaurant empire was not just recovering from the highly publicized cancellation of the wedding, it was actively and aggressively expanding. He was currently acquiring 3 new boutique properties across the city, aiming to unify them under a single corporate umbrella, and preparing to launch a comprehensive digital loyalty and reservation platform. However, his current tech infrastructure was severely outdated. His point-of-sale systems were fragmented. His customer relationship management software was practically non-existent, and his digital strategy was a chaotic mess. He desperately needed a complete ground-up overhaul of his back-end systems, secure data management protocols, and a modernized digital marketing approach. He laid out a detailed, highly lucrative contract, formally offering me the position of lead digital strategy consultant for his entire hospitality group. The numbers he presented on the screen were staggering. He was offering a monthly retainer that would effectively double my already substantial tech salary, elevating my earning potential to the absolute top tier of my professional field. I read through the contract parameters he forwarded to my email in real time, analyzing the scope of work, the cybersecurity requirements, and the expected deliverables. It was a massive, complex undertaking, but it was exactly the kind of high-stakes, intricate puzzle I thrived on solving. I accepted his offer on the spot. We bypassed the usual corporate red tape, establishing a powerful, purely professional alliance right then and there over the secure connection. It was a fascinating, poetic turn of events. I was now doing high-level, lucrative corporate business with the exact man my sister and mother had foolishly tried to con. I immediately registered a dedicated consulting LLC, restructuring my daily schedule to accommodate the massive influx of new responsibilities. The work was incredibly demanding, but deeply rewarding. Over the next few months, I completely revamped his digital architecture. I streamlined his reservation algorithms, integrated a seamless point-of-sale network across all his locations, and secured his financial databases against the exact kind of vulnerabilities my family had so easily exploited. As the fiscal quarters progressed, and our professional victories piled up, our dynamic evolved into something remarkably special. Our interactions remained deeply respectful and strictly professional, but a profound unspoken trust formed between us. We operated with absolute transparency and direct communication, a refreshing necessary change from the deceit, gaslighting, and manipulation that had previously defined our forced connection through Madison. Jamal became a steady, reliable presence in our lives, far beyond the scope of a standard corporate client. He would occasionally drop by the house to review the latest analytics or test new software interfaces, always making sure to bring a specialized sensory toy or a complex mechanical puzzle for Leo. My son, who usually shrank away from new people and required strict boundaries, took an immediate liking to Jamal's calm, patient, and unassuming energy. Jamal never forced interaction. He simply sat on the floor quietly helping Leo sort the puzzle pieces by color and shape. It was the ultimate irony. Out of the ashes of my biological family's spectacular implosion, I had found an actual functioning chosen family. Jamal and I had both survived the toxic fallout of the same greedy narcissistic people, and we had emerged on the other side, stronger, significantly wealthier, and completely unburdened by their chaos. We built an enduring bond based purely on mutual integrity, shared ambition, and uncompromising honesty. It was a powerful daily reminder that blood meant absolutely nothing compared to the healthy, respectful family you actively choose to build. 6 months dissolved into the rhythm of a demanding, deeply satisfying routine. The bitter winter chill had descended upon the city, freezing the last remnants of the chaotic summer into solid, quiet ice. As the new year commenced, the federal criminal trial for Madison's aggravated identity theft and wire fraud finally loomed on the official court docket. The rapid, total liquidation of their assets and the crushing weight of the venue chargebacks had left my family utterly destitute. There were no high-powered, expensive defense attorneys retained to weave clever legal loopholes or arrange quiet backroom settlements. Thomas and Brenda had exhausted every predatory loan and burned every social bridge they possessed in the immediate aftermath of the arrest. They were reduced to relying on an overworked, chronically exhausted public defender who looked completely indifferent to their manufactured drama. They had been stripped of their designer wardrobes, their country club memberships, and their arrogant posturing, leaving them entirely exposed to the unyielding mechanical grind of the federal justice system. The preliminary hearings took place inside a sterile, heavily fortified federal courthouse that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I did not have to attend these initial proceedings, but I received regular, detailed updates through the Victim Advocacy Portal, reading the official transcripts with a clinical, detached fascination. Madison, desperate and facing the very real prospect of a multi-year federal prison sentence, attempted to play her final, most desperate card. During her evidentiary depositions, she leaned heavily into the role of the naive, sheltered daughter. She wept uncontrollably for the court stenographer, wiping away non-existent tears as she claimed total, profound ignorance of the financial mechanisms funding her extravagant lifestyle. She swore under penalty of perjury that she had absolutely no idea the platinum credit cards were secured under my stolen Social Security number. She spun a pathetic, transparent narrative, insisting that her parents had managed every single financial aspect of the wedding planning. She claimed they had simply handed her the plastic and told her the bills were completely covered by Thomas's fictional offshore investments, painting herself as a helpless, innocent victim of her parents' reckless financial mismanagement. The moment Brenda and Thomas learned of Madison's legal strategy, the fragile, toxic ecosystem of our family violently and completely cannibalized itself. The absolute terror of facing steep mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary instantly annihilated any remaining shred of parental loyalty or protective instinct. Brenda and Thomas, realizing their beloved golden child was actively trying to secure a lenient plea deal at their direct expense, retaliated with a brutal, self-serving ferocity. They instructed the public defender to file counter-affidavits that threw Madison directly into the line of fire. Thomas testified under oath that Madison had always been dangerously obsessed with maintaining a wealthy image, and that she was the one who had secretly bypassed my credit monitoring locks using personal information she had hoarded since childhood. Brenda eagerly corroborated the lie, swearing to the prosecutors that Madison had masterminded the entire fraudulent operation, stealing the identity and opening the accounts entirely behind their backs to fund her delusional, lavish wedding. The official transcripts read like a dark, twisted, tragic comedy. The people who had spent my entire life presenting a unified, impenetrable front of suburban perfection were now viciously tearing each other to pieces in a desperate bid to save their own skins. They offered up their favorite daughter to the federal prosecutors without a second of hesitation, perfectly willing to watch her rot in a cell if it meant a reduced sentence for themselves. Madison immediately retaliated by leaking digital correspondence that highlighted her parents' active complicity in hiding the stolen funds and dodging the initial bank inquiries. There was no loyalty, no love, and no honor left among them. When the stolen money vanished, so did the illusion of their devoted family unit. They were just three desperate criminals trapped in a sinking ship, violently clawing at each other in a futile, pathetic attempt to stay above the waterline. Sitting in my spacious, sunlit home office, I reviewed the final subpoena requiring my attendance at the upcoming trial. I traced the raised seal of the federal court on the thick parchment paper, noting the stark contrast between my current reality and the terror I used to feel whenever their names appeared on my phone. I closed my laptop, the screen reflecting the serene, quiet space I had built for Leo and myself, and walked into my bedroom to prepare for the week ahead. I pulled a sharp-tailored charcoal suit from my closet, letting my hands run over the high-quality fabric. I selected a crisp white blouse and polished my minimalist heels, organizing my wardrobe with a calm, methodical precision that mirrored my internal state. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror and saw a woman who had been fundamentally transformed by the fires of the past year. I was no longer the anxious, financially crippled outcast, constantly waiting for the next psychological blow. I was a highly successful, heavily compensated tech consultant, a secure homeowner, and a fiercely protective mother who had completely outmaneuvered her abusers at every single turn. I packed my leather briefcase, sliding the court summons inside, next to my encrypted work tablet and a fresh notepad. I was not going to that courthouse as a trembling victim forced to defend her own sanity or beg for the court's belief. My evidence was absolute. My finances were bulletproof, and my life was utterly severed from their toxicity. I was going as a resilient, untouchable observer. I planned to sit upright in the polished oak gallery, completely silent and perfectly composed. I was ready to watch the cold, heavy machinery of the legal system grind their remaining lies into dust, ready to witness the definitive end of the people who had tried to destroy me, and ready to walk out of those heavy brass doors without ever looking back. 6 months later, pushing open the heavy brass doors of courtroom 4B, the air felt instantly chilled and sterile, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the life I had built outside. I took my seat in the very back row of the gallery, sliding my leather briefcase under the polished wooden pew. The criminal trial for Madison's aggravated identity theft and wire fraud was finally underway. When the prosecution called Jamal to the witness stand, the entire energy of the room immediately shifted. He walked to the front with the effortless, commanding stride of a man completely in control of his domain. Wearing a flawlessly tailored dark navy suit, he projected absolute authority and unyielding calm. He did not look at Madison, nor did he spare a single glance for my disgraced parents, who were visibly trembling at the defense table alongside their exhausted public defender. The lead prosecutor began by walking Jamal through the timeline of the initial venue booking, establishing the baseline of the fraud. Jamal was clinical, articulate, and devastatingly precise. He did not rely on emotional appeals or dramatic rhetoric. He relied entirely on cold, hard math and undeniable digital architecture. With the aid of a massive digital projector illuminating the center of the courtroom, Jamal guided the captivated jury through the irrefutable paper trail surrounding the $80,000 deposit. He systematically broke down how the funds initially wired in good faith to secure his flagship property for the wedding were immediately intercepted and diverted. Utilizing the flawless audit logs generated by the very tech infrastructure I had recently helped him overhaul, Jamal showcased the exact digital route the money had taken. He explained how the $80,000 did not go to a vendor, a legitimate event planner, or a holding account. Instead, Jamal demonstrated with pristine clarity how the funds were deliberately fractured into smaller, untraceable increments to avoid banking alerts, and then funneled directly into a series of obscure offshore shell accounts located in the Cayman Islands. The public defender slumped lower in his chair, not even bothering to voice an objection as the prosecution displayed the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The primary account holder for every single one of those offshore entities was Madison. When it was time for the defense to present their case, the desperation in the room reached a palpable fever pitch. Madison was called to testify in her own defense, and the resulting spectacle was nothing short of pathetic. She had completely discarded her usual designer labels and heavy makeup, opting instead for an ill-fitting conservative cardigan and flat shoes, attempting to visually manufacture the illusion of a demure, naive girl caught in a massive misunderstanding. As she took the oath and sat in the witness box, she immediately deployed her signature tactic. She scrunched her face, her breath hitching dramatically as she tried to force a torrent of sympathetic tears. She wept loudly into the microphone, her voice trembling and breaking as she spun a ridiculous, highly convoluted story. She claimed that she thought the offshore accounts were simply standard wedding funds set up by her wealthy father, and she swore under oath that she had absolutely no idea how international wire transfers, identity theft, or credit routing actually worked. But the tears she so desperately tried to summon never actually materialized. Her eyes remained completely dry, darting nervously toward the jury box every few seconds to gauge their reaction. The jury, however, did not offer her an ounce of sympathy. Their faces were carved from absolute stone, their expressions a mix of skepticism and outright disdain. The lead prosecutor stepped up for cross-examination and effortlessly, methodically dismantled her entire charade in a matter of minutes. He projected the metadata linked to the offshore accounts, displaying the specific IP addresses utilized to authorize the illicit transfers. The digital footprint traced directly back to Madison's personal laptop and her primary mobile device. Furthermore, the precise timestamps of the transfers coincided exactly with her appointments at luxury bridal boutiques, high-end caterers, and elite florists. The prosecution painted a vivid, undeniable picture for the jury. They did not see a victim of circumstance or a clueless bystander. They saw a highly calculated, deeply greedy manipulator who had actively and aggressively orchestrated the theft to fund an opulent fantasy she had zero intention of paying for. The sheer weight of the evidence and the grotesque nature of the betrayal seemed to permeate the very walls of the courthouse. As the defense fumbled through a disastrous, disjointed closing argument, the presiding judge leaned forward, his patience entirely exhausted. In a rare break from stoic judicial decorum, he interrupted the proceedings to address the defendants directly. His voice resonated through the silent room with profound, unmistakable disgust. He stared down at Brenda Thomas and Madison, articulating the complete moral bankruptcy of their actions. He stated that in his decades on the bench, he had rarely witnessed such a coordinated, vicious effort by a family to systematically bankrupt a hardworking mother. He explicitly condemned their absolute willingness to exploit a child's severe disability, noting that they had gleefully weaponized my son's vulnerabilities and leveraged his safety just to save face and maintain a pathetic, hollow illusion of high society grandeur. He called their actions a despicable mockery of family, indicating heavily that their total lack of remorse would be factored strictly into their impending sentencing. I sat in the back row, listening to the judge perfectly summarize the agonizing reality I had endured for my entire life. A profound, overwhelming sense of closure washed over me, settling deep into my bones and releasing the very last knot of tension I carried. I realized in that moment that I did not need to wait for the jury to deliberate. I did not need to hear the foreman read the official guilty verdicts, nor did I need to listen to the exact number of years my biological family would spend locked behind federal bars. The trial was merely a formality at this point. The real battle had already been won months ago when I finally decided to fight back and build my own fortress. I checked the sleek, expensive watch on my wrist. I had a high-level digital strategy meeting scheduled with Jamal's executive board in exactly 45 minutes, followed by a trip to the local bakery to pick up Leo's favorite gluten-free cupcakes to celebrate his excellent week at the academy. I reached down silently, retrieving my leather briefcase. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. My heels clicked softly, but with absolute certainty, against the marble floor as I turned my back on the defense table for the final time. I pushed open the heavy brass doors and walked out into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight, merging into a beautiful, busy world where I had vastly better things to do with my time. The bright, crisp afternoon sunlight washed over me as I stepped away from the federal courthouse, my mind instantly pivoting away from the toxic spectacle and toward the intricate digital ecosystems I was actively building. I hailed a cab, attended a highly productive 2-hour strategy session with Jamal's executive board, and finished my day watching Leo joyfully demolish a vanilla cupcake at our favorite local bakery. I did not spend a single second agonizing over the jury's deliberations. It was exactly 48 hours later, while I was comfortably seated at my kitchen island reviewing wireframes, that my phone vibrated with an encrypted email from Eleanor Vance. The subject line was blank, but the attached PDF contained the official sentencing decree. The jury had deliberated for barely 4 hours. Madison was found legally and unequivocally guilty on all 7 counts of felony wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The judge, entirely unmoved by her manufactured tears and desperate attempts to shift the blame, handed down a severe, unyielding sentence. Madison was ordered to serve 36 months in a federal correctional institution, followed by 5 years of heavily monitored probation. The fantasy of the luxury bridal suite had been permanently replaced by the stark, sterile reality of a federal processing center. Furthermore, the financial penalty was equally devastating. She was slapped with a massive 6-figure restitution order that would ruthlessly garnish any legitimate wages she might ever earn for the rest of her natural life. The golden child, the protected princess of the family who had never been told no, was now formally documented and processed as a federal inmate. Brenda and Thomas did not escape the courtroom's wrath. While they narrowly avoided joining their favorite daughter in a prison cell, the federal magistrate did not let their active complicity slide. They were hit with crippling financial penalties for serving as accessories after the fact, aiding in the concealment of stolen funds, and attempting to obstruct a federal investigation. The government levied heavy immediate fines against them, but those federal penalties were merely the first domino to fall. The civil lawsuits they had been desperately dodging finally caught up to them in a crushing tidal wave of aggressive litigation. The elite country club sued them directly for the breached venue contract and the loss of revenue. The imported floral vendor, the luxury caterers, and the boutique bridal shop all filed aggressive claims for unpaid services, deploying relentless collection agencies that called their phones at all hours. Combined with the mounting debts from their own panicked attempts to hire private legal counsel before ultimately settling for a public defender, their fragile financial structure completely imploded. The offshore accounts were seized, their credit lines were frozen, and their bank accounts were drained. Within weeks of Madison's sentencing, Thomas and Brenda were forced into a corner with absolutely no remaining exits. They formally filed for Chapter 7, total bankruptcy, legally surrendering to their absolute undeniable financial ruin. The immediate casualty of their bankruptcy was the ultimate symbol of their manufactured superiority. The bank initiated a swift and merciless foreclosure on their pristine, sprawling suburban home. The sprawling estate with its manicured lawns, high ceilings, and perfectly curated rooms, the very stage where they had spent decades diminishing my worth and amplifying Madison's, was officially repossessed. I heard the grim details later through a mutual acquaintance who had watched the spectacle unfold from across the street. There were no professional moving companies, no organized packing crates, and absolutely no dignified exit. Brenda and Thomas were given a strict, non-negotiable eviction date by the local sheriff's department. On a dreary, overcast morning, they were reduced to frantically shoving whatever loose belongings they could fit into the trunks of their aging sedans. The bank changed the heavy brass locks, physically barring them from the life they had sacrificed their morality to maintain. Stripped of their assets and their credit destroyed, they were forced to sign a lease for a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment located in a neglected industrial district on the far outskirts of the city. Their new reality consisted of peeling paint, flickering streetlights, and the constant roar of highway traffic miles away from the affluent gated zip codes they considered their birthright. The physical displacement was brutal, but the social exile was absolute. My parents had dedicated their entire existence to climbing the social ladder, cultivating superficial relationships based purely on status, wealth, and perceived prestige. The moment the federal indictments became public record, that shallow community severed all ties with ruthless surgical efficiency. Brenda was formally expelled from her elite charity committees, her frantic calls sent directly to voicemail. Thomas was quietly but firmly removed from the country club's executive board, his membership revoked due to the morality clause hidden deep within the bylaws. The people they had so desperately tried to impress, the very audience they had ruined my credit and jeopardized my son's future to appease, treated them like a highly contagious disease. When Brenda ventured into their old neighborhood to run errands, former friends would cross the street to avoid making eye contact. The whispered gossip and open judgment were inescapable. The ultimate status-obsessed family had been reduced to absolute grinding poverty, trapped in a tiny, drafty apartment with nothing but the crushing weight of their own choices for company. They were entirely exiled from the glittering social circles they had worshipped, forced to live in total obscurity and shame. They had traded their real daughter, their grandson, and their basic human decency for a fake lifestyle that abandoned them the second the money ran out, leaving them with absolutely nothing. Exactly 12 months passed, washing away the final lingering residue of that bitter winter and replacing it with a season of explosive, unprecedented growth. My consulting firm did not just survive the chaotic upheaval of the previous year, it fundamentally conquered the competitive Seattle tech sector. The proprietary digital integration system I had originally designed and implemented for Jamal's flagship properties evolved into an absolute industry standard. What began as a secure, impenetrable financial architecture to prevent internal fraud blossomed into a massive cloud-based operational matrix. It streamlined everything from global supply chain logistics to automated payroll, rendering traditional hospitality management software entirely obsolete. In late October, that very architecture won the highly coveted Innovator of the Year award at the Pacific Northwest Tech Summit. Walking across that brightly lit stage to accept the sleek glass trophy, listening to the genuine, thunderous applause of elite software developers and venture capitalists, I felt the definitive validation of my professional worth. I was no longer fighting for a seat at the table or begging for scraps of corporate respect. I owned the table. My client roster was completely booked for the next 3 years, securing lucrative contracts that afforded me a level of unshakable financial supremacy my parents could never have achieved in 10 lifetimes. I was featured in major industry publications, highly sought after for keynote speeches, and recognized as a definitive authority in secure systems architecture. That towering financial fortress allowed me to provide Leo with the environment he always deserved. He was now attending an exclusive, highly specialized academy tailored specifically for gifted neurodivergent children. The transformation in my son over the past year was nothing short of miraculous. Without the constant suffocating weight of Thomas and Brenda's ableist judgments pressing down on him, Leo's spirit expanded to fill the space. There were no more toxic whispers about his social awkwardness, no more disgusted sighs when he avoided eye contact, and absolutely no more forced conformity to rigid neurotypical expectations. Instead, his brilliant mind was fiercely celebrated. The academy featured sensory-friendly classrooms and educators who engaged directly with his unique processing style. He joined a competitive robotics team, spending his afternoons happily debating engineering mechanics and coding variables with peers who understood his exact wavelength. His posture straightened, his laughter became frequent and uninhibited, and the chronic anxiety that used to plague his evenings vanished entirely. He was thriving, encouraged to explore his intense fixations on computer science and digital rendering without ever feeling like he needed to apologize for who he fundamentally was. Watching him confidently present a complex digital rendering at the school's spring exhibition, his voice steady and his eyes bright, was the single greatest achievement of my life. The true measure of our new reality, however, was best displayed in the backyard of the spacious mid-century modern home I had recently purchased in the hills overlooking the Puget Sound. It was a flawless Saturday afternoon in early summer, and the air was thick with the scent of hickory smoke and grilled vegetables. Jamal stood at the massive outdoor kitchen island expertly flipping cedar plank salmon while aggressively debating the finer points of predictive consumer algorithms with two of my senior developers. My friend Denise was pouring iced tea, laughing loudly at a highly technical joke Leo had just delivered about artificial intelligence. The contrast between this vibrant, joyous gathering and the suffocating, performative holiday dinners of my past was staggering. There was no undercurrent of hostility, no passive-aggressive comments masking deep-seated jealousy, and no agonizing tension waiting to detonate over a misplaced fork or an incorrect conversation topic. This was my chosen family. We were a collective of brilliant, driven individuals, bound together by mutual respect, shared ambition, and genuine friendship. We did not need to wear designer labels to prove our worth or weaponize our bank accounts to demand blind loyalty. Jamal had seamlessly transitioned from a vital business ally into a fiercely protective uncle figure for Leo, mentoring him in business logic while I handled the tech. We simply enjoyed each other's presence, creating a vibrant ecosystem of absolute peace, laughter, and unconditional support. Standing on the edge of the expansive cedar deck holding a cold glass of lemonade, I looked out over the sprawling green lawn. I watched Leo demonstrate a newly built remote-controlled drone to Jamal, both of them cheering loudly as the device performed a flawless aerial flip. A profound, unshakable contentment settled deeply into my chest, radiating through every fiber of my being. For 30 years, I had been systematically conditioned to believe that I was the designated scapegoat, the flawed, unremarkable middle child who would inevitably fail to launch. Leo had been cruelly written off by his own grandparents as the weird kid, an embarrassing inconvenience to be hidden away in the dark shadows of their suburban perfection. Yet here we were. The scapegoat and the weird kid had entirely outmaneuvered the golden child and the status-obsessed socialites. We had not just survived their coordinated vicious attempts to destroy us, we had utilized the wreckage to lay the invincible foundation for a spectacular empire. I had built a completely impenetrable life, rich with authentic love, towering professional success, and absolute financial security. The toxic machinery of my biological family was a million miles away, rusted and broken beyond repair. They were permanently trapped in the miserable, impoverished exile of their own making, entirely forgotten by the world they tried to conquer. Meanwhile, Leo and I stood firmly in the warm golden light of a beautiful, unyielding reality, finally and forever free. That freedom became a quiet, enduring baseline, transforming my everyday existence from a state of hypervigilance into one of absolute, unshakable tranquility. As the warm summer faded into a crisp, rain-slicked Seattle autumn, my routine settled into a comfortable, productive rhythm. It was late November on a particularly dismal gray Tuesday afternoon when the universe decided to test the structural integrity of that newly built piece. I had a rare gap in my afternoon schedule between client calls and Leo's robotics tournament. Taking advantage of the brief window, I drove my new midnight blue Porsche sedan across town to a specific old-school tailor and dry cleaner, located in a rapidly gentrifying but still undeniably gritty industrial neighborhood. They were the only specialists I trusted to properly handle a delicate vintage silk dress I planned to wear to an upcoming tech gala. The air outside was thick with coastal drizzle stinging my cheeks as I locked my car and stepped onto the cracked, uneven pavement. I pulled the collar of my tailored camel hair wrap coat tighter against the chill, my leather boots sidestepping deep puddles of oily water. The bell above the glass door chimed a sharp metallic note as I pushed my way inside the establishment. The interior was a jarring assault on the senses, a stark contrast to the sterile, pristine environments I usually inhabited. The air was heavy, humid, and choked with the sharp, acidic scent of industrial bleach and burnt lint. Fluorescent tube lights buzzed angrily overhead, casting a sickly pale green hue over the peeling linoleum floor. I approached the worn laminate counter, placing my ticket down for the elderly clerk who shuffled into the back room to retrieve my garment. As I waited in the quiet, damp stillness, a harsh, rhythmic scraping sound drew my attention to the far corner of the adjacent laundromat section. A lone figure was hunched over a heavy industrial mop bucket, aggressively scrubbing at a stubborn dark stain near a row of humming washing machines. The woman wore a shapeless, faded gray uniform smock that hung loosely off a gaunt, deeply stooped frame. Thick, cheap yellow rubber gloves covered her hands, which gripped the wooden mop handle with white-knuckled desperation. She paused her frantic scrubbing to cough a wet, rattling sound and slowly straightened her spine, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of a soapy, trembling arm. As she turned her face toward the center of the room, the harsh fluorescent lighting caught her features with brutal, unforgiving clarity. I froze the breath temporarily stalling in my lungs. It was Brenda. The physical deterioration was absolutely staggering. The woman standing 10 feet away from me bore almost zero resemblance to the impeccably groomed, status-obsessed socialite who had terrorized my entire existence. The expensive, meticulously maintained blonde highlights were entirely gone, replaced by a harsh, wiry gray that grew out from her scalp in an unkempt, jagged line. The expensive dermal fillers and pristine cosmetic enhancements had completely dissolved, leaving her skin deeply lined, sallow, and sagging heavily around her jaw. She looked remarkably fragile, visually aged by at least 2 decades. The crushing, inescapable weight of absolute poverty and federal bankruptcy had violently stripped away her artificial armor, exposing a hollow, exhausted, and fundamentally broken shell of a human being. For a fraction of a second, she continued to stare blankly in my direction, her mind clearly dulled by hours of backbreaking minimum-wage labor. Then the recognition hit her. I watched the exact moment the realization registered in her sunken, bloodshot eyes. The heavy, wooden mop handle slipped from her wet grip, clattering loudly against the damp linoleum and echoing sharply through the cavernous, empty room. Brenda's gaze darted frantically over me, absorbing the visual evidence of my reality. She took in the pristine cut of my designer coat, the expensive leather of my boots, and the heavy diamond-encrusted keys to my luxury sedan resting casually in my manicured hand. She saw the radiant, untouchable confidence radiating from my posture, the unmistakable aura of a woman who wielded massive financial power and commanded absolute respect. The contrast between us was violent and undeniable. I was the very embodiment of the elite, wealthy status she had systematically destroyed her own life and sacrificed her family to desperately cling to. And she was scrubbing toxic chemicals off a public floor for minimum wage. A tremor violently seized her thin shoulders. Her chest heaved under the ugly gray smock. She took a single hesitant, dragging step forward. Her eyes pooled with hot, desperate tears, spilling over her deeply lined cheeks. She raised one yellow-gloved hand, trembling violently in the humid air, reaching out toward me across the sterile divide of the laundromat. Her chapped, cracked lips parted silently, forming the first syllable of my name. It was a pathetic, transparent display, a desperate, opportunistic attempt to bridge a chasm she had spent 30 years digging. I knew exactly what was coming next. It would be a frantic, tearful plea for forgiveness, immediately followed by a pathetic, sobbing demand for financial salvation, a desperate attempt to latch onto my wealth to escape the miserable, impoverished hell she had built for herself. Years ago, encountering Brenda would have triggered a massive, debilitating panic attack. My heart would have raced, my palms would have sweat, and I would have been instantly crushed by the conditioned instinct to cower, apologize, or defend my very right to exist. But standing there under the buzzing fluorescent lights, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no surge of adrenaline, no lingering anger, no vindictive desire to gloat, and certainly no pity. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had happily handed me over to the wolves to protect a fictional narrative, and I felt only a vast empty void. The fear had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a glacial, impenetrable indifference. I did not offer a smirk. I did not utter a single cutting syllable. I did not even break my relaxed, confident posture. I simply looked right through her, letting my eyes pass over her weeping, trembling form with the exact same casual detachment I would afford a smudge on the glass door. She was completely insignificant, a harmless, powerless ghost from a dead timeline. The elderly clerk returned to the counter, placing my garment bag carefully in front of me. I turned my attention smoothly away from Brenda, smiling warmly at the clerk, as I tapped my sleek black card against the payment terminal. I picked up my dry cleaning, draped it securely over my arm, and pivoted gracefully on my heel. I walked straight toward the exit, my stride even measured and entirely unbothered. The heavy glass door swung shut behind me, the bell chiming its sharp farewell, instantly cutting off the sound of Brenda's choked, ragged sob. I unlocked my car, settled into the plush leather seat, and started the quiet, powerful engine. I pulled away from the curb and merged smoothly into the city traffic, never once looking back in the rearview mirror. I had deployed the ultimate fatal weapon, complete, absolute silence. The sleek engine of my Porsche purred as I navigated away from the dilapidated industrial district, leaving the bleak, detergent-scented purgatory of my past firmly in the rearview mirror. The coastal drizzle gave way to breaking clouds as I wound my way up the steep, winding roads toward the hills of the Puget Sound. By the time I pulled into the smooth, expansive driveway of my mid-century modern estate, the afternoon sun had fully pierced the gray overcast, bathing the property in a brilliant golden warmth. I keyed in my access code, watching the heavy iron security gate slide shut behind me, effectively sealing out the rest of the world and locking in the serene reality I had painstakingly constructed. Walking through the heavy oak front door, I was instantly enveloped by the comforting, quiet hum of domestic tranquility. The air was perfectly climate-controlled, carrying the faint, pleasant scent of cedar and the roasting garlic from the meal I had prepped earlier. I kicked off my leather boots and stepped into the spacious, sunlit living room. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the sparkling, deep blue water below, completely flooding the open-concept space with vibrant natural light. I had barely set my briefcase on the polished travertine coffee table when I heard the rapid, joyful thud of footsteps echoing down the hardwood hallway. Leo practically skidded into the room, his eyes bright and his posture radiating an effortless, secure energy that still managed to take my breath away every single time I witnessed it. He held a piece of heavy sketching paper carefully in his hands, presenting it to me with a wide, impossibly proud smile. I took the thick parchment, letting my eyes absorb the vibrant, highly precise details of his artwork. It was a colorful, intricately designed digital rendering he had created and printed out from his specialized Academy tablet. The image depicted the three of us, Leo, myself, and Jamal, standing around a large, smoking barbecue grill under an impossibly bright blue sky. We were all smiling, captured in a beautifully rendered moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Beneath the vibrant, meticulously shaded figures, written in Leo's remarkably neat, blocky handwriting, was a simple, profound caption, "The best family." My chest tightened with a fierce, overwhelming surge of love. I pulled my son into a deep, lingering hug, burying my face in his hair and silently thanking the universe for the undeniable, beautiful reality of this exact moment. After Leo bounded back to his room to finish a complex robotics module, I walked into my private home office and woke my primary workstation. The massive curved monitor illuminated the quiet room, displaying the pristine, heavily encrypted dashboards of my financial and business portfolios. I clicked through the secure interfaces, absorbing the staggering multi-million-dollar balances sitting securely across a diversified network of international investments, high-yield municipal bonds, and aggressive tech equity holdings. My consulting firm was operating at maximum unprecedented capacity, generating a torrential, unstoppable stream of passive and active revenue that grew exponentially by the hour. I looked at the cascading green numbers, the visual proof of my total market dominance, and then glanced through the open doorway to where I could hear Leo softly humming to himself as he worked. A profound, crystal-clear realization washed over me, settling deep into the very core of my identity. The ultimate, most devastating revenge against the people who had actively tried to destroy me was not watching Madison trade her designer gowns for a drab federal prison uniform. It was not witnessing the total humiliating bankruptcy of Thomas and Brenda, nor was it the sterile satisfaction of seeing my mother aggressively scrub filthy linoleum floors for minimum wage. True revenge. The absolute unassailable victory was my current untouchable peace. They had desperately wanted me to break to beg to remain the miserable, financially crippled outcast they could perpetually manipulate for their own cruel amusement. Instead, I had utilized their toxicity as raw combustible fuel. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, letting the quiet, unyielding luxury of my home settle around me. The silence in the house was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of fear or anticipation that had defined my childhood. It was the light, breathable silence of total, absolute security. I closed my eyes and let the defining truth of my journey solidify in my mind. They tried to ban me from a wedding to protect their image. In return, I banned them from my life and protected my empire. Never let anyone who treats you like a footnote hold the pen to your story. The words resonated with the heavy weight of an unbreakable vow. I had allowed them to dictate my worth for far too long, blindly buying into their manufactured hierarchy because it was the only toxic ecosystem I had ever known. But the very moment they attempted to weaponize my son's existence to preserve a pathetic suburban illusion, they handed me the exact tools I needed to dismantle their power entirely. I powered down the monitors, watching the glowing screens fade to a sleek, polished black, and stood up from the desk. I walked back into the main living area, tracing my fingers along the smooth, expensive textiles and the custom architectural details that defined my private sanctuary. I had successfully severed every single parasitic tie to the machinery of my past, replacing it with a towering fortress of absolute financial independence and emotional empowerment. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next psychological blow, nor was I a survivor, merely clinging to the wreckage. I was the supreme, undisputed architect of my own destiny. The malicious, calculated banishment that was designed to completely erase me had instead served as the ultimate catalyst, igniting the inferno that forged my current reality. I had taken their worst, most vicious attacks and transmuted them into the bedrock of a magnificent, impregnable life. Standing in the center of the beautiful empire I had built with my own two hands, surrounded by the people who genuinely cherished me, I knew with absolute unwavering certainty that the game was over, and I had definitively won. The most profound lesson from Riley's journey is that true vindication doesn't come from witnessing the downfall of those who wronged you. It blossoms from cultivating your own untouchable peace. When tied to a toxic family, the ultimate triumph is severing those parasitic bonds and channeling that pain into personal growth. Riley realized that success is not defined by winning the approval of abusers, but by creating an impregnable sanctuary of authentic love and independence. Never let anyone who treats you like an afterthought dictate your life's narrative. Share a time you chose peace over toxic drama, and comment below.